For example, in terms of preventive deployment, certainly a government can request the United Nations to send observers or to send troops for preventive deployment. That is in the charter. It is clearly a possibility. The problem is when there is no government, or when the government itself is not sure what the government is, like perhaps in Somalia. We are now coming into a situation where you may find a whole range of countries, which means where law and order has broken down, and the government therefore has broken down and there is no authority. Then what is the legal framework for the United Nations to come in? What is the legal basis for its operation? This is a very important issue. The second important issue is if a country continues to commit gross violations of human rights, possibly genocide against a people, what is the mechanism which is available for the United Nations to intervene in that particular situation? Although there is provision in that the genocide is a violation of fundamental human rights, the mechanism upon which the UN can act is still very weak and needs to be worked on. The other area is what happens in a large number of cases where the law and order situation has broken down and where there are different armed groups who are competing for power, but where the civilians are being affected with massive famine and displacement of people. How can one bring in law and order into that situation? This is where the concept of transitional authority, which is being tried out brilliantly in Cambodia, is a very useful instrument in developing that idea. Others have now begun to propose the idea of a trusteeship, which is based on the old idea of the trusteeship within the United Nations, which was restricted to the colonies, that perhaps the United Nations should make use of the trusteeship council to develop the idea of keeping some countries or regions in trust until law and order is brought in. For example, in the Kurdish situation in Iraq, for example, the concept of safe havens was developed, which was intended to mean that in certain situations where a minority is vulnerable to be attacked by a government, in this case the Iraqi government, some of the countries deeply involved in that situation, in this time Britain, the United States, talked about safe havens and the right to intervene on a humanitarian basis, despite the sovereignty of a particular country. Now, this may also be a basis for new interventions by the United Nations in the future. The important thing is to develop a legal framework under these kinds of interventions, where the legal framework is very clear and the mandate is very clear. As you see, what is happening is that more and more the United Nations is moving away from the traditional peacekeeping role, for which it has a brilliant history, of which it has won the Nobel Prize and achieved a very successful operations. Now the United Nations is called upon to move into new areas where the mandate and the legality of that operation is not still very clear.